Hello, and welcome to Cox Notes, where you're just liable to see just about anything. But I want to dedicate some time today on a little bit of the problem that we all are having right now with all the stay at home and the COVID-19 scare and all of that that's going on. And you can tend to just get stir crazy just sitting around, waiting for your butt to get bigger. And I think there are other answers. Now, I'm going to put some disclaimer in here. I'm not here to discourage professional help and all that stuff, but I want to give you an idea of what I've done over the years when things just get a little bit overwhelming. What you're about to see is a presentation that I have given to visitors at Colorado State Parks. And it's something that I put together a long time ago and modified it a couple of times. But it's, I think, a way that we can cope. So lean back for a few minutes and join me in some Colorado therapy. Several years ago, when I began my career as a law enforcement officer, I went through a period when I thought that everyone who broke the law did so as a personal affront to me. I had a hard time leaving my job at the front door of my home. I ended up with stomach problems and would lay awake at nights worrying about the solution to a burglary or thinking about getting back into my patrol car and going out to prevent some unknown crime. When I finally realized that I could not personally solve all of the world's problems, I also realized that I had some passions that were much healthier than worrying about things I could do nothing about. Hunting, fishing, and being outdoors have always been important to me. But for the last 40 years or so, they've been tantamount to my mental health. I'm not sure that overall hunting and fishing is less expensive than a few visits to a therapist's office, and I'm not advocating to avoid therapy if it's needed, but I do know that an evening fishing trip is every bit as much of a mental boost as anything else I can do. Of course, I'm lucky. In less time than it takes to eat lunch, I can be up on the Grand Mesa at some wonderful natural lake. I can be at some secluded section of the North Fork of the Gunnison River. Or I can be challenging the crappie at Crawford Reservoir. We all have those special places where we just feel better by being there, whether it's high in the mountains or at a Rockies game in Denver. But for me, taking advantage of these gives me peace of mind, and at times literally lowers my blood pressure to an acceptable level. Tranquility is an important part of what I'm talking about here. This is the upper lake on Buckhorn Lakes near Montrose, and I often go there. This is one of my special places that I want to address. I can get to Buckhorn Lakes within an hour or so from my home in Montrose, and it's one of those places to go, and we all have them, and we need to take advantage of them. I'm really such a small part of this world. But just looking back over the Uncompahgre Valley from near Buckhorn Lakes is enough in itself to remind me how insignificant we really are in the overall scheme of things. Watching wildlife, observing the first of the wildflowers in the spring, and looking at the snow-capped mountains gives me a sense of being connected to the world. A couple hours of fishing makes it even better. I want to give you a little background so you know who I am and why I have this passion for explaining why I think hunting, fishing, hiking, and similar activities can help keep us straight with the world around us and actually contribute to our mental health. I'm not going to tell you that there's no place else in the world where this is true. It's quite the contrary. My belief is, and I will explain this more as we go along, that just about everywhere has an opportunity. I was born in Cripple Creek, Colorado. No, not in the Imperial Hotel seen here in the foreground, but up the street there at St. Nicholas Hospital. And I come from a long line of Colorado families. My third great grandfather, James Castello, first came to Colorado in the early 1860s. He's credited, among other things, for founding the town of Florissant, and he was one of the first judges in the Park County of Colorado Territory. Among the hundreds of old family photos that I have, there is a recurring setting. A significant number of those photos were taken during family outings. Picnics, hunting camps, and fishing trips were always very popular with my family, and they still are. My grandmother had 15 children. 13 of those children lived to be adults and have families of their own. Grandma Beals once told me that the easiest way to take care of kids was to turn them loose in the mountain meadow someplace and let them run off into the aspen trees in search of mushrooms or other delights. Just months before she died at the age of 93, she was still going out on family outings and still appreciated a bouquet of dandelions presented to her by one of the youngsters. For several years, I was the publisher and editor of a small newspaper based in Cedar Edge, Colorado. As part of my agreement with the corporation that owned the newspaper, I wrote a weekly outdoor column entitled The Sportsman's Corner. The column was copyrighted under my name. In a large part, that column was based on exactly what we're talking about here, and I often dug into my past excursions or related family stories about outdoor adventures. In 2014, I published a book, Fishing Close to the Bank, which was largely based on what I wrote over the years in the Sportsman's Corner for the Mountain Valley News. While the book covers a lot of where to fish, it is intended more as a metaphor and hopefully gives the reader a reason to fish. The metaphor, if you will, is that all too often we overlook what we have within reach just to go out on some adventure. And that requires a lot of travel and a pile of cash, but we don't need to cast clear out to the middle of the lake. The big fish might be just under the bank. In the first chapter of Fishing Close to the Bank, I reference Isaac Walton and The Complete Angler. I first read this book when I was about 12 years old, and I have reread at least parts of it several times since then. The book was first published in 1653. My copy pictured here is only about 100 years old and is the so-called New English version. The original title is spelled Complete, C-O-M-P-L-E-A-T. And for those of you that have not had the pleasure of reading The Complete Angler, basically it's a story of three comrades who take an excursion together. One is a angler, one is a hunter, and the other is a falconer. And during their trip, they agree to exchange information as to the intricacies of their particular sports. I often compared the excursion by that was described in The Complete Angler, with different adventures that I and my friends went on during my teenage years. I want to acknowledge two other authors that had a great influence on what I'm talking about today. The first is Bill Logan. Bill first started writing for the Rocky Mountain News as a correspondent covering political stories. He was an avid outdoorsman, especially when it came to fly fishing. Ultimately, he became the outdoor editor, and he wrote a regular column relating to mostly outdoor stuff. I met Bill back in the early 1980s, but I was familiar with his work long before then. I always thought I had it in me to do what he did, and he's one of the major reasons that I took lots of photos and took lots of notes. I tried several times to sell the idea of writing an outdoor column similar to what Bill wrote. Until I took over the Mountain Valley News, my efforts failed. Bill retired in late 1990, but continued to write his Outback column on Sundays. He died in 1993. The Rocky Mountain News died in the early 2000s and no longer exists. I keep referencing those special places that I love to go, but it was not until I began reading the novels written by Diana Gabaldon did I find a good name for those places. Gabaldon's work has nothing to do with fishing or hunting or recreation of any sort, but in The Scottish Prisoner, she refers to a Fridstool. Because I was very familiar with Gabaldon's habit of inserting little tidbits of history into her stories, I went looking for the real meaning of that word. Her character described it as a peaceful place or a place of sanctuary. A goodly amount of research left me with the opinion that the word probably came from an old Saxon name for a chair that was placed in a church near the altar and used by those seeking sanctuary. The Saxon word is Fridstool. I like the word Fridstool as used by Gabaldon and begin using it myself. My Fridstools are places where I can go and be alone. Sometimes there are other people around, but I still feel alone. The house I grew up in Ouray, Colorado, was built in 1887. As a result of an addition added in the 1920s, there was a flat roof outside my second floor bedroom window. This is the view that I had from that window. The roof was easily accessed by simply opening the window and stepping out onto the roof. I spent untold hours sitting on that rooftop, reading a book or doing homework or simply just sitting and looking at Mount Hayden. I guess this was my first Fridstool. I just don't know, or I didn't know what to call it back then. Nearly 400 miles from that house in Ouray was a lake that did a great deal when it came to my outdoor therapy that I am referring to here. Located about 30 miles north of Burlington, Colorado, Bonnie Lake State Park was established in 1966. The lake was the result of a dam on the South Republican River. Several years ago, the dam was holding back more water than was going on downstream and was deemed to be in violation of water compacts with the downstream states. As a result, the lake was completely drained and the area closed to being a state park. The area is now a state wildlife area. I went to Burlington in the early 1969 to marry the love of my life. I had originally planned on staying in that area for a short period, but fate intervened and I stayed 10 years. I started a 20-year law enforcement career there, ultimately became the undersheriff of Kit Carson County. During those 10 years, Bonnie Lake, became a source of survival. I left an area where there were more mountains to climb, rivers to fish, and an abundance of deer and elk and rabbits and other game animals to hunt, and I landed in the high plains of eastern Colorado. Believe me, I took advantage of everything that Bonnie had to offer. I fished there, hunted ducks there, tried my hand at skiing on water rather than snow, and even became all too acquainted with at least one rattlesnake. Bonnie Lake is gone, but the memories remain. Now, I want you to come along with me as I recall some other spaces that are really special, and I hope you can use them to determine your own spaces and establish your own Fridstools. In the late 1940s, after World War II, the Bureau of Reclamation had some serious talks about damming up the water that came from Ironton Park, south of Ouray. The project never culminated, but it did result in further studies into the storage of water. The Dallas project was actually okayed in 1956, but was all an on-again, off-again project for many years. At one point, the plan was to build a dam that would result in the demise of the town of Ridgway. The high water would have been about 1 mile south of the existing town of Ridgway. The Dallas project was finalized in 1968, but controversy and discussions continued for nearly 10 years. Construction began in 1978 and was completed in 1987. The result being Ridgway Reservoir, Ridgway State Park, and another Fridstool. It's important to have Fridstools summer and winter alike. Another of my favorites is the Paco Chupac area right below Ridgway Reservoir. Ice fishing provides another great getaway and a place to think. There's nothing like a high mountain lake to bring serenity into your life, but you don't have to make long hikes. This one's right beside the highway. Sometimes I just like to head for the high country, and I like to go as early in the season as possible. I have to admit that sometimes presents some challenges. Many times I have just sat, filled my head full of wonderful thoughts, and stared down into the bottom of the Black Canyon, which is only a few miles from my house. Isaac Walton, in The Complete Angler, says, "Oh, the gallant fisher's life, it is the best of any. 'Tis full of pleasure, void of strife, and it is beloved by many." And fishing is a great reliever of stress. But you can put a Fridstool just about any place, and you can be alone, sometimes alone with other people, but just sit and contemplate on life and reduce the pressures. Thanks for watching, and have a wonderful day.